The October morning smelled like rotting leaves and coffee. Main Street in Riverside wasn't what it used to be, boarded up storefronts, a dying bank branch, the movie theater replaced by a vape shop. But the hardware store still stood, unchanged for 40 years, its green awning faded to the color of old money. James Hutchins pushed through the door at 7:47 a.m., same as every Tuesday. He was a creature of habit, a man who'd spent 32 years following orders, schedules, protocols. Retirement at 65 had been neither relief nor disaster. It was simply what came next. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, came home with his mind mostly intact and his left leg functional enough. The tremors in his hands came and went. The nightmares had become background noise. The hardware store was his anchor, 40 minutes every Tuesday morning. He'd buy something small, a box of nails, a can of wood stain, a single roll of weather stripping, and spend time with Marcus, the owner, a man 2 years his senior who'd never served but understood the language of discipline and routine. This Tuesday, the store was crowded. James noticed her immediately, the way his trained instincts notice threats. A woman in her late 40s, blonde hair expensively colored, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head despite the overcast sky. She wore yoga pants that cost more than James's monthly grocery budget and a cream-colored North Face jacket. She was photographing the checkout counter on her phone, making small, disgusted sounds in the back of her throat. "These prices are absolutely predatory," she said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for the entire store to hear. 47 cents for a screw? You could buy 1,000 screws online for half this price. Marcus stood behind the counter, his jaw working. He was used to this. Everyone was. Amazon had killed Main Street in 1,000 towns across America. Small business owners had learned to smile through the insults. "We offer convenience and expertise," Marcus said carefully, "and we're invested in our community." "Your community?" the woman laughed. "This town is a graveyard. You're all dinosaurs. You all deserve what's happening." She turned away, walking deeper into the store, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown clock. James pretended to examine a display of hinges. He was good at being invisible when he needed to be, though invisible was the last thing he felt. His nervous system was screaming, threat assessment, tactical analysis, the old programming that would never fully shut down. He forced himself to breathe through his nose. The woman found something else to criticize, then something else. A rust spot on a shelf, the outdated inventory system, the lack of diversity in the store's hearing. James recognized the type. He'd encountered them before, usually at the VA hospital or the community center. People for whom complaining was a form of oxygen necessary to survive, to prove they were paying attention, that they mattered. He selected a package of heavy-duty brackets and moved toward the register. The woman was still circling, her commentary a constant low-level hum of contempt. James kept his eyes forward. "I'm reporting you to the Better Business Bureau," she was saying. "And I'm posting about this on Nextdoor. People need to know they can support actual legitimate businesses instead of enabling this kind of exploitation." Marcus's hands were shaking. James could see it in the way he was double-bagging purchases, the careful, methodical movements of a man trying not to say something he'd regret. James stepped up to the counter and placed the brackets down gently. "Hey, Marcus, how's Carol?" "Good, good. She's at her book club meeting. Should be home in a couple hours." Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes had gone distant, the way they did when he was fighting to keep it together. "Mine was the same way," James said. He didn't have a wife anymore. Linda had left in 2009, right after his first deployment to Afghanistan, but the lie was small and useful. "Every Tuesday, book club. She loved her books more than she loved me, I think." Marcus smiled, the first genuine one since James had entered the store. A moment of human connection across the counter, a small rebellion against the chaos of the modern world. The woman materialized at James's shoulder with sudden intensity, the way certain people do when they sense they haven't been sufficiently acknowledged. "Are you a regular?" she asked him, not out of friendliness but out of calculation. James turned to look at her directly, mistake, but also the only honest thing to do. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "about 20 years. "Well, you might want to consider shopping elsewhere." She pulled out her phone again, pointing it at him now. "I'm documenting this store's exploitative practices and the culture of complacency that enables them. You strike me as ex-military or law enforcement. Am I right?" He didn't answer. The army had trained him to remain silent under interrogation, and this felt like interrogation. Of course I'm right, you have that look, disconnected, like you think you're better than everyone else. She was recording him now, James realized. The red light was blinking. Well, let me tell you something, your service doesn't make you special. It doesn't give you the right to perpetuate harmful systems. Blind nationalism is what created the military-industrial complex and people like you. Ma'am, James said quietly, please stop recording me. His voice was soft, but something in it, something from the before times, from barracks and briefings and the command chain, made her pause, for exactly 1 second. Then her face hardened. I have every right, this is a public space, and your aggressive posturing is exactly what I'm talking about, threatening behavior, intimidation. She turned to Marcus. Did you see that? He threatened me. I didn't, James started. You did, you absolutely did, and now I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of people support this business. She turned away from them both and walked toward the door, still holding her phone up, still recording. This man, this veteran or whatever, bullying me because I had the audacity to hold this community accountable. The door chimed as she left. James felt something drain out of him, not anger, which would have been relief, but a kind of helpless resignation. He'd seen this before. The video would be online within minutes. The comments would be vicious in both directions. His photo, his face, would be dissected by strangers. He'd be a talking point on whatever Facebook group she ran, whatever community forum had given her the illusion of importance and power. I'm sorry, Marcus said. Not your fault. It is, though, this is my store, I should have. You couldn't have done anything differently. People like that, they're looking for a fight they can win. And they always win because they're willing to burn down the bridge just to say they crossed it. Marcus rang up the brackets, 47 cents per screw, apparently, and James paid cash like always. As he walked out of the store, he caught sight of his reflection in the window. An old man in an army surplus jacket, his hair going gray, his face lined and worn. He looked exactly like what he was, someone who'd been left behind by history. He didn't know that behind him, Marcus was already making phone calls. He didn't know that the store would empty over the next 10 minutes as people received messages, as word spread through a network older than social media and more powerful. The network of neighbors, longtime residents, people who'd watched Main Street die one brick at a time. He didn't know that the woman, Corinne Phillips, had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. By noon, her video had 30,000 views. By evening, it had 50,000. And by the next morning, the entire community had seen it. Corinne Phillips had moved to Riverside 6 months ago, and she'd spent every moment since discovering new ways to be offended by it. She lived in the renovated Victorian on Elm Street, the one that had belonged to the banker for 40 years, the one she'd purchased for a fraction of what it would cost in the city because, as her therapist liked to say, she needed to find authenticity and community roots. What she'd found instead was a town full of people she considered her intellectual and moral inferiors, which gave her an endless supply of causes to champion and grievances to broadcast. She worked remotely as a social media consultant, a job that seemed to involve posting aggressively about various injustices and then blocking anyone who disagreed with her. She had 17,000 followers on Instagram, 11,000 on TikTok, and was a moderator on 4 different next-door neighborhood groups. She'd created a Facebook page called Riverside Accountability, specifically to document the town's failures. The potholes, the lack of diversity in local hearing, the refusal of the town council to divest from fossil fuels, the problematic, historical numbing of several streets. No one had voted for her to do this. No institution had authorized her. But she'd appointed herself as Riverside's conscience anyway, and she did it with missionary zeal. The video had been a genuine triumph. She'd posted it to all her platforms with captions like, "This is what white privilege looks like. Intimidation dressed up as politeness. And male veterans aren't above accountability," and her personal favorite, "If you support local businesses that exploit their customers, you're complicit in capitalism's cruelty." The comments had poured in, a mix of her followers agreeing passionately and random people she'd never met defending the veteran and telling her to leave small towns alone. She'd blocked 43 people by midnight. When she woke up on Wednesday, her post had gone viral. Local news outlets had picked it up. There were headlines: "Small town confrontation highlights rural America's demographic crisis," and "Veteran accused of intimidation in hardware store altercation." The comments had exploded into the tens of thousands. Some supported her, the eternal chorus of internet activists who'd never been to Riverside and never would, who saw the town as a symbol of everything wrong with America. But others, tens of thousands of others, wanted to know who she was, and they were not kind. People had found her Instagram, her TikTok, her Facebook pages. They'd screenshot her posts about how rural people were destroying the planet, and small-town values are just tribalism disguised as nostalgia. And why should I respect a culture of ignorance? Someone posted the original unedited video, the one that showed what had happened right before James turned around. It showed Karen loudly criticizing the store, demanding Marcus's attention, and then, crucially, showed James not moving toward her, not threatening her, not even looking at her when she spoke to him. He'd just been standing quietly, holding his brackets. The narrative shifted. The intimidation she described never appeared in the footage. By Thursday morning, her Nextdoor account had been flooded with comments. Neighbors had identified her, not difficult, given that she'd posted multiple selfies in front of her Victorian house, her designer car, her artisanal coffee setup. They'd found her website for her social media consulting business. They'd found her previous addresses, her previous social media accounts from other towns, a pattern of conflict and complaint that stretched back years. In Portland, there'd been a dispute with her yoga studio when they'd asked her to stop confronting other clients about their fast fashion choices. In Boulder, she'd made a lengthy complaint to the planning board about a neighborhood dog park, with a 70-page document detailing why it violated several municipal codes and her own personal peace. In Santa Fe, she'd attempted to organize a protest against a local bakery owner for not sourcing his flour from exclusively local organic suppliers. She was a virus, the internet decided, moving from place to place, looking for the next community to heal. That's when the phone calls started. The first one came Thursday morning at 9:47 a.m. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but she was expecting a call from a prospective client. "Hello," she said in her professional voice, the one she used when she was being strategic rather than righteous. "Is this Karen Phillips?" The voice was male, older, with a heavy Midwestern accent. "This is she. May I ask who?" "You called a veteran aggressive and intimidating in a video that now has 1 million views." The man's voice was calm, factual, terrifying in its lack of emotion. "That veteran is James Hutchins. He served 2 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. He came home with PTSD and a damaged leg, and he spent the last 15 years trying to be a good neighbor in this community. And you made him look like he threatened you." "I wasn't. The video shows." Karen's voice had lost its authority. She sounded young, suddenly uncertain. "The unedited video shows you confronting my friend at his place of business. It shows him standing quietly while you recorded him and insulted him. That's what it shows. And now he's getting messages from people calling him a bully. His therapist at the VA is worried about a relapse. His PTSD is flaring up. He hasn't slept in 2 days." "I didn't know." "That's your problem. You never know. You blow into a town, decide you're smarter than everyone, and start a crusade. And when people get hurt, you just move on to the next place." He hung up. Karen called the police. What they could do about a phone call, she wasn't sure, but the officer who took her complaint was unenthusiastic. "He didn't threaten you verbally," the officer said. "And your video is public record. People are allowed to respond to public information." By Friday, her business website had been wiped out. Not hacked. She'd checked with her web host. But her email inbox was flooded with cancellation notices from clients who'd Googled her name and come across the Nextdoor discussions. Potential clients were withdrawing their inquiries. One message included a screenshot from her website bio where she'd written about her commitment to justice and community, edited with a red circle, and the words, "except this," pointing at her face. Her Nextdoor account had been suspended for violating community standards regarding harassment. She'd appealed, but the decision was upheld. The comments on her Instagram were so vicious that she'd had to put her account on private, delete hundreds of posts, and block thousands of users. People had created parody accounts in her name: Karen's accountability page, small town destroyer, certified professional complainer. The hashtag #Riverside Karen was trending in a 3-state region. Someone had called the local news and given them the full context of her previous towns, her pattern of conflict, the mountain of evidence that this wasn't about justice at all. It was about a particular personality type finding endless reasons to feel superior and wronged simultaneously. By Saturday, a local news team showed up at her door. Ms. Phillips, a young reporter with carefully styled hair and a practiced smile, stood on her porch. Behind her, a cameraman was setting up. "We'd like to ask you a few follow-up questions about the video you posted on Tuesday." Karen tried to close the door. The reporter put her hand against it gently. "Just a few quick questions. How do you respond to claims that you selectively edited the video? Can you comment on your social media history in other communities? Do you regret the impact your post has had on Mr. Hutchins?" Karen's face was flushed. She could see neighbors watching from across the street. Mrs. Chen from next door had been watering her garden and was now standing perfectly still, phone in hand, recording. Karen had written a lengthy post about Mrs. Chen's antiquated gardening practices and their impact on the neighborhood's aesthetic and sustainability. "I have nothing to say," Karen said. "Just one more question," the reporter said, and her smile was gone now, replaced with something harder. "Do you think you owe Mr. Hutchins an apology?" Karen slammed the door. The clip would air on the 6 o'clock news, Karen's face red with anger, the door closing, the reporter's final question hanging in the air unanswered. News directors loved that kind of footage. It told the story without needing commentary. A woman caught in the act of refusing accountability, the irony so thick you could cut it with a knife. That night, Karen sat in her living room, the one she'd spent $40,000 renovating, the one she'd posted 6 times on Instagram with captions about preserving small-town charm while embracing contemporary aesthetics. And she scrolled through her phone. A Reddit thread had been created. "Everything we know about Riverside's Karen." It had 35,000 upvotes. Her entire life was being dissected with the precision of a military operation. Someone had found her college yearbook and posted a photo with the caption, "Even then, she had that face." Someone else had analyzed her hand motions in the video and claimed she was being manipulative and calculated. Most of it was speculation. Some of it was cruel. But the core facts were undeniable. She'd been wrong about James Hutchins. The video she'd posted hadn't shown what she'd claimed. Her history suggested a pattern of professional victimhood. And in an age where everyone was armed with cameras and the internet, there was no way to hide from that truth anymore. Her phone rang, unknown number. Then again, unknown number. Then again. She turned it off. At that moment, 5 miles across town, James Hutchins was sitting in Marcus's office in the back of the hardware store, staring at his hands. The store had been busier than usual all week, people coming in specifically to support Marcus, to buy something small and unnecessary and stand next to the counter and shake their heads about what had happened. Some of them had brought him gifts, a military-themed coffee mug, a framed photograph of the Riverside Post sign. One woman had brought him a homemade casserole because, as she'd said, that's what people do for each other. He'd never been comfortable with attention, but he was beginning to understand that attention wasn't the worst thing. What was worse was isolation, invisibility, the feeling that no one cared when someone tried to destroy you. "She's getting destroyed online," Marcus said, not without sympathy. "I heard she's thinking about leaving town." "Good," James said, and meant it. "Then I shouldn't say that." "Why not? She came into my store and accused me of being exploitative. She recorded you without permission. She lied about what happened. Why shouldn't she face consequences?" It was a question James didn't have a good answer for. The old rules, the ones they'd taught him in the army, said that once an enemy was defeated, you didn't keep firing. But the internet didn't follow the old rules, and he wasn't sure if defending him constituted keeping fire on her or if she deserved every bit of it. "Because maybe we should be better than her," James said finally. Marcus smiled sadly. "That's the thing about good people, Hutch. We always want to be better, and they always take advantage of it." Karen Phillips moved through the next week like a ghost, present but not truly there, watching her life disintegrate with the strange detachment of someone witnessing a disaster happening to someone else. By Monday, 3 clients had demanded refunds, claiming her work had been inadequate and threatening to leave negative reviews. By Tuesday, her bank account had been drained by chargebacks she was trying to dispute. By Wednesday, the HOA of her neighborhood, a group she'd served on for 3 months and had already attempted to reorganize along lines more aligned with her values, had issued a formal complaint about her property being associated with ongoing harassment issues and warned her about potential violations. The absurdity of that particular cruelty wasn't lost on her. She'd complained about the HOA's bylaws for 8 weeks. She'd written 17 pages of formal correspondence identifying what she considered outdated and potentially discriminatory provisions. She'd proposed sweeping changes, and now that same HOA was using their authority to marginalize her. She called her therapist, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, a woman she'd seen every Tuesday in Riverside and every other week before that via video conference for the past 3 years. Their sessions typically involved Karen describing various situations where she'd been wronged, misunderstood, or prevented from doing the good work she'd appointed herself to do. "I'm thinking of leaving," Karen said. She was sitting in her living room, the designer aesthetic now seeming like a mockery of itself. "The community has turned on me. They don't appreciate what I'm trying to do." "Tell me about that," Dr. Okonkwo said in the gentle, measured tone she used when she was about to say something Karen didn't want to hear. "I tried to hold them accountable. I tried to point out their problems, and they're attacking me for it. That veteran, he's gotten the whole town mobilized against me. And for what? For asking a legitimate question about exploitation." "Did you ask a legitimate question, or did you make an accusatory statement?" Dr. Okonkwo's voice was still gentle, but there was steel in it now. "It's the same thing." "Is it?" Karen felt something angry and sharp rise up in her chest. "Are you taking their side?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Dr. Okonkwo said carefully. "But I'm noticing something that we've discussed before. Can we talk about the pattern?" The pattern, the thing that had followed Karen through Portland, Boulder, Santa Fe, and now Riverside. The thing Karen preferred to think of as recognizing injustice, and that Dr. Okonkwo kept gently suggesting might be something else. "What pattern?" Karen asked, already defensive. "Karen, you've moved to 5 different cities in 8 years. In each one, you've started by identifying problems in the community. You've become very focused on these problems, to the exclusion of much else in your life. You've organized people around these causes, and each time there's been a conflict that's resulted in you being criticized, and then you've moved to the next city. Because they don't want to actually change anything. They want to stay ignorant and comfortable." "Or," Dr. Okonkwo said, and Karen could hear the weight of something difficult in her voice, "you've been approaching these situations in a way that doesn't actually create change, but instead creates resentment and conflict." "So it's my fault?" "I'm not assigning fault. I'm noticing a pattern that might be worth examining. And Karen, I want to say this gently. The way you're talking about this situation, the way you're talking about Mr. Hutchins and the community, doesn't leave any room for the possibility that you were wrong, that you misunderstood something, that you caused harm." Karen ended the call. She called her therapist a charlatan. She found a new therapist online who specialized in highly sensitive people and social justice advocacy. She didn't book an appointment. By Thursday, the financial situation had become genuinely dire. Her consulting business was generating negative income. The refunds exceeded what she was earning. She'd have to go back to getting a W-2 job, which meant the pretense of independence, of being her own boss, would evaporate. It meant sitting in an office. It meant losing the flexibility to post long threads about whatever cause had seized her attention that week. Her mother called. "I saw the video," her mother said without preamble. "The one from that store." "It was taken out of context." "Karen, I watched it. That old man wasn't doing anything. You were recording him and saying things about the business. He asked you politely to stop recording him." "He threatened me with his demeanor." "Did he?" The question hung in the air, and in that silence was everything Karen had been avoiding. The possibility, however small, that she'd been wrong, that she'd misread a situation, that her certainty, her absolute conviction that she understood justice better than everyone around her, had led her to cause real harm to someone who hadn't deserved it. "I don't want to talk about this," Karen said. "Of course you don't," her mother said, and Karen heard in that simple sentence a history of conversations just like this one. Her mother, always quiet, always patient, always pointing out the thing Karen was refusing to see. Her mother, whom Karen had been grateful to escape from at 18, because her mother represented a kind of passivity that Karen found morally abhorrent. Now at 47, Karen wondered if perhaps her mother's passivity had just been restraint. "Are you coming home?" her mother asked. The words were kind, but Karen heard the subtext. The defeat implicit in the question, the way home had always been what you retreated to when you'd failed everywhere else. No, Karen said, but she wasn't sure she meant it. That night she did something she hadn't done in days. She read the comments on her video. Not the supportive ones, she'd read those first, building a wall of righteousness around herself, but the ones from people defending James Hutchins. This woman is a predator. She came to a small town and decided everyone was beneath her. The entitled behavior is unreal. She recorded a guy who was minding his own business. Does anyone know if this guy is getting support? Someone should start a GoFundMe for him. It was that last comment that broke something in her. There were, in fact, someone starting a GoFundMe for James Hutchins. She found it by Googling his name. Support a hero. Stand with James Hutchins had raised $73,000 in 4 days. People from across the country were donating. There were comments from other veterans. There were comments from people in small towns talking about how this situation had made them feel seen, like someone finally understood that small-town businesses and small-town people weren't automatically villains. The narrative had fully inverted. Karen had set out to expose exploitation and injustice. Instead, she'd become the villain, and James Hutchins, a quiet old man who just wanted to buy some brackets, had become the hero. Friday, October 18th at 3:47 p.m., Karen Phillips made a decision. She recorded a video. It was filmed in her living room, natural light from the windows, no filters, no editing. She looked tired and hollow, the designer facade stripped away. She was holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "My name is Karen Phillips," she said to the camera, her voice small and shaking. "On Tuesday, October 10th, I posted a video on social media accusing a man named James Hutchins of intimidating and threatening me in a hardware store. That video was wrong. I was wrong." She paused, and in that pause was genuine struggle, the effort of a person trying to say something true after weeks of saying things that were convenient. "I went into Marcus's hardware store looking for problems. I was angry at the world, and I was looking for someone to blame. When Mr. Hutchins stood quietly near me, I interpreted his presence as threatening. But it wasn't. He was just standing there. He asked me to stop recording him, and when I refused, I claimed he was intimidating me. He wasn't. I was being cruel, and when he didn't respond the way I wanted, I tried to destroy him with a video." Another pause. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying performatively. This was the kind of crying that happened when someone was breaking. "The internet found out about my past behavior in other towns. They found out that I do this kind of thing repeatedly, and I want to say that they're right. I do this. I come to towns, I decide the people are wrong, I try to fix them. And when they don't let me fix them, I attack them. It's a pattern. I do it over and over." She looked directly at the camera, and in her eyes was something like recognition, like seeing herself clearly for the first time in years. "James Hutchins is a good man. He served our country. He came home hurt, and he spent 15 years trying to be a good neighbor. He didn't deserve what I did to him. I falsely accused him of something he didn't do, and I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry." She took a breath. "I'm leaving Riverside. I'm going to get help. I'm going to try to understand why I do this, why I'm so certain that I know better than everyone else, why I need to turn every situation into a battle. And I'm not going to post any more accusations online until I've worked through these issues with a therapist." It was, by any measure, a good apology. Specific, without excuses, with recognition of pattern and commitment to change. It was everything she should have said immediately, should have said the moment she watched the unedited video and understood her mistake. She hit post. Within minutes, the video was being shared. Some people were suspicious, claiming it was performative, a calculated move to salvage her reputation. Some people accepted it as genuine, which somehow felt worse to her than the accusations, because it meant there was a chance at redemption, and redemption meant responsibility. She waited for James Hutchins to respond, to make a public statement, to accept or reject her apology. He didn't. The video went out into the world, and James remained silent, as he'd remained silent throughout the entire ordeal. Quiet, still unavailable for the narrative that everyone else was constructing around him. That night, Karen packed a suitcase. Not everything, just enough for a week, maybe 2. She called a realtor and asked about selling the house. She withdrew her listing from all professional networks. She closed her social media consulting business, offering refunds to everyone who'd paid in advance. And on Saturday morning, she drove north, away from Riverside, away from the community that had rejected her, away from the man she'd tried to destroy. In her rearview mirror, the town receded into the distance, smaller and smaller until it was just a cluster of buildings against the autumn sky. The community waited for James to respond to Corinne's apology video, and in their waiting, they revealed something true about themselves that none of them had anticipated. They wanted retribution. Not the subtle kind, not the kind that satisfied itself with Corinne leaving town and losing her business. They wanted him to reject her apology publicly. They wanted him to sue her. They wanted some definitive moment where he would stand in front of cameras and deliver the justice that the internet had been delivering on his behalf for a week. What they got instead was nothing. James Hutchins did not record a response video. He did not appear on the news. He did not give interviews. He did not accept or reject Corinne's apology or make any public statement whatsoever. This was somehow worse for the community than if he'd been angry. By the second week, the narrative had begun to shift again. Some people said that his silence was a kind of condemnation, that by refusing to engage, he was expressing the ultimate rejection. Others said that his silence was grace, that he was demonstrating a moral superiority that Corinne could never reach. A third faction said that his refusal to capitalize on his newfound celebrity status showed that he was genuinely a good person, not an opportunist like Corinne. Everyone projected onto his silence what they wanted to believe about humanity and justice, and the proper response to being wronged. What they didn't understand was that James's silence came from a much simpler place. He was broken in a way that had nothing to do with Corinne Phillips. 2 days after Corinne's video, James had a panic attack in the grocery store. He was in the cereal aisle, reaching for the same brand he'd been buying for 4 years, and suddenly his heart was hammering in his chest, and his vision was narrowing, and he couldn't breathe. A clerk had found him sitting on the floor between the Cheerios and the Lucky Charms, hyperventilating, and had called an ambulance. The ER doctor had confirmed what James already knew: panic attack, trauma response. His nervous system was flooded with cortisol and adrenaline and something else, the ancient code that said he was in danger and needed to survive. The thing was, he wasn't in danger anymore. He'd never been in danger from Corinne Phillips, but his body didn't understand that. His body was processing the experience through the lens of every other time he'd been ambushed, every other time someone had recorded him or accused him or made him the subject of a narrative he couldn't control. It was processing it through the lens of patrol routes in Kandahar, of mortar fire that came from nowhere, of the essential unpredictability of warfare. He increased his therapy appointments. He was prescribed a new medication, one that made him foggy in the mornings. He cut back on his visits to the hardware store. He spent more time at home in the small house he'd owned for 18 years, the house where Linda had left him, the house that had become his safest place in the world. The GoFundMe for him had reached $137,000. His therapist suggested he think about what he might do with that money. James said nothing. The money was staying in the account, accruing interest, a monument to something he didn't want to think about. Marcus came by on Wednesday of the third week, carrying a pie his wife had made. Carol wanted to check in, Marcus said, though they both knew he'd come on his own because Carol was at book club like always. You look like hell. Feel like hell, James said. They were sitting in his kitchen, in the same chairs they'd sat in for 18 years, having the same kind of conversation they'd had 100 times before. The only difference was that now the whole town was invested in their friendship in a way that made everything feel fragile and watched. The panic attacks, Marcus asked. Yeah, got a new med, still adjusting. You thinking about leaving town? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, though it made sense. Everyone was wondering if James would leave, if the spotlight would be too much, if he'd take his $100,000 and disappear like Corinne had. No, James said. This is my home. I've lived here longer than I lived anywhere else except the army base. I'm not leaving. Corinne's gone, you know. Sold the house already, went into some corporate program where they buy it at fair market value and resell it. She left 3 days after her apology video. Good, James said without hesitation. You should feel like you won. James shook his head. Winning would mean none of this happened. Winning would mean I bought my brackets and we all went on with our lives. Instead, there's $100,000 sitting in an account with my name on it because I stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. People wanted to support you. I know, and I'm grateful, but gratitude isn't the same as peace. Marcus left the pie and drove back to the store. By 8 o'clock that evening, both he and Carol had been quoted in 3 separate articles about small-town solidarity, and Marcus was being invited to speak on a podcast about the economics of community and the importance of supporting local business. He declined, but the invitations kept coming. The thing about becoming a symbol is that you stop being allowed to be a regular person. You become a container for other people's beliefs, hopes, and narratives. James had learned this in a very different context, in 2001, when he'd signed up for a job that had seemed clear and necessary at the time, and had become instead something far more complicated. He had not chosen to become a symbol then, either. By the end of the 4th week, the story had largely faded from the national news. Karen Phillips was no longer trending. The hashtag #RiversideKaren had been replaced by newer hashtags, newer controversies, the endless scroll of internet outrage moving on to its next target. But in Riverside itself, the intensity hadn't faded. If anything, it had metastasized into something deeper and more complicated, a sense that the town had been tested and had passed, had demonstrated that it still had values and would defend those values, even against one of its own. The problem was, those values had now become a weight that James had to carry. When he went to the hardware store, conversations stopped. People stared. Someone had left a donation basket at the register saying, if you don't want the GoFundMe money, donate it to his favorite charity. No one knew what his favorite charity was. James volunteered at the VA, but calling it his favorite felt reductive. When he went to the VA for his appointment, he was treated differently, other veterans nodding at him, some wanting to shake his hand, one wanting to photograph him. A sign had been posted in the common room, proud to serve alongside heroes like James Hutchins. He'd asked them to take it down, and they had, but not before at least a dozen people had seen it and had their impression of him crystallized around that single frame. He had become famous for standing still while a woman recorded him. In his nightmares, he was being recorded constantly, filmed by infinite cameras, dissected by infinite eyes, his stillness being interpreted as 1,000 different things by 1,000 different observers. He woke up sweating at 3 in the morning on the 28th day, after Karen's apology video. He called Dr. Sarah Martinez, his therapist, whose emergency number he'd been given 6 months ago for situations like this, when the world got too loud and his nervous system couldn't process the noise anymore. I think I'm having a breakdown, he told her. They booked an emergency session for the next morning. Dr. Martinez, a woman in her 50s who'd worked with trauma victims and combat veterans for 30 years, listened to him describe the last month without judgment. The problem, Dr. Martinez said, is that you've been defined by something you didn't choose. First by the army, which was a choice, though a complicated one. Then by a war, which was a choice that led to consequences you didn't anticipate. And now by a community that's decided you're their hero because you stood still while someone was cruel to you. I don't want to be their hero. I know, but that's what you've become. And you're trying to carry that weight on top of everything else you're already carrying. That's too much. That's too much for anyone. So what do I do? First, you acknowledge that you didn't sign up for this. Second, you set boundaries with the community that's trying to make you into a symbol. Third, you focus on your own healing, not on their narrative about what happened. They won't like that. They won't, Dr. Martinez agreed. But their liking it or not is not actually your responsibility. October turned into November, and in that turning, something broke inside the narrative that Riverside had constructed around itself and James Hutchins. It started with a letter to the editor of the Riverside Gazette, the local newspaper that had existed for 97 years and still printed on Thursdays. The letter was written by Patricia Hendricks, who owned a bookstore on Main Street and was known as a thoughtful woman with strong opinions. I'm concerned, she wrote, about how we've responded to the Karen Phillips incident. We were right to reject her accusations and her behavior. But I'm wondering if, in defending ourselves and James Hutchins, we've created a new problem. We've turned him into a symbol, and in doing so, we've stopped treating him like a person. The letter continued, describing how James seemed withdrawn now, how he was coming to town less frequently, how the constant attention seemed to be making his PTSD worse, not better. I worry, Patricia wrote, that we're celebrating our community's values while ignoring the actual cost to the person at the center of this story. Justice isn't just about proving we were right. It's about healing. And I don't think James is healed. I think we've prevented him from healing by making him a trophy to display. The letter should have been unremarkable. Small-town newspapers printed columns like this all the time, local voices reflecting on local events. Instead, it cracked something open. Within days, other people were having the same conversation. At the coffee shop, at the post office, at the hardware store where Marcus started refusing to engage in conversations about the James situation. If you brought it up, he would say, "The man asked for privacy. That means we give it to him," and would change the subject to something else entirely. It became clear, in the way these things do in small towns, that there was a split. One faction still wanted to celebrate the community's solidarity and justice. Another faction was beginning to realize that they'd created something toxic in the name of solidarity. And James, somehow caught between these two interpretations of events he'd never chosen to participate in, was paying the price either way. He was sitting in his house on a Thursday evening, the Gazette open on his lap, Patricia Hendricks's letter visible when his phone rang. It was a woman he didn't recognize. "Mr. Hutchins, my name is Rebecca Morrison. I'm a producer at NPR. We'd like to do a follow-up story about your experience and how the community has responded." "No," James said. "We'd be very fair and balanced." "No," James said again and hung up. The calls kept coming. Different producers, different outlets, all wanting a follow-up, wanting him to comment on Coren's apology, wanting to explore the lessons about community that his situation had taught. He stopped answering the phone. By mid-November, his therapist suggested something radical. "I think you need to leave," Dr. Martinez said during one of their sessions. "Leave town. Temporarily, not because anyone drove you out, but because you need space from this narrative. You need to exist somewhere where you're not the veteran from the Coren video. You need to remember who you are when no one's watching." James had never left Riverside for longer than a week. Even his vacations, such as they were, had been short trips to nearby towns, ways of being away without really being away. "Where would I go?" he asked. "Anywhere," Dr. Martinez said. "The point isn't the destination, the point is the distance." He looked up flights that evening. The GoFundMe money was still sitting in the account, untouched, useless except for this, a way to go somewhere, to disappear for a while. He booked a 2-week trip to Asheville, North Carolina. A place he'd never been, far enough away that no one would know him, small enough that it wouldn't be aggressively foreign. He packed light, just a backpack with clothes and toiletries and a paperback book he'd been meaning to read. Before he left, he sent an email to Marcus. "Going to be gone for 2 weeks. Please don't tell anyone where I'm going. Don't explain it. Just say I needed some time to myself." Marcus called him immediately. "You're leaving." "Temporarily, I'll be back." "The whole town's going to think." "I know what they'll think. I don't actually care anymore, Marcus. I've spent 4 weeks being what everyone needed me to be. I need to be what I need to be, even if it ruins whatever narrative they've built." "It won't ruin it," Marcus said. "It'll just change it." And it did. James left on a Sunday morning, driving out of Riverside as the sun was coming up, the town still mostly asleep. By the time he was an hour away, Marcus had sent a carefully worded email to a few people he trusted. James needed to get away for a bit. Medical reasons, let's give him privacy. What had been meant as privacy became, in the way of small towns, a narrative. James had left because the town had been too much. James had left because he was traumatized by Coren's actions. James had left because the community had failed to protect him properly. James had left because they'd made a mistake somewhere, somehow. By the time he reached Asheville, 3 hours away, there were 4 different theories circulating about why he'd gone. He turned off his phone. For 14 days, James Hutchins existed in a state of almost perfect anonymity. He stayed in a small hotel and spent his days walking through the Blue Ridge Mountains, eating in restaurants where no one knew his name, reading in coffee shops where he was just another older man with a paperback. He slept, which he hadn't done properly since before the video. He ate without his stomach twisting. He looked at mountains and water and trees and felt something in his chest loosen, fractionally, the beginning of recovery. On the 8th day, he called Dr. Martinez. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Quiet," he said. "My mind is quiet for the first time in a month." Hold on to that, she said. That's what healing feels like. He returned to Riverside on a Sunday evening, driving back through landscape he'd learned by heart over 18 years. The mountains gave way to foothills, then to rolling farmland, then to the strip malls and familiar roads that meant home. No one was waiting for him. Marcus had done what he'd asked, kept the silence, didn't announce his return. The next morning, James went to the hardware store. It was a Tuesday, like always, like those days that felt like they belonged to a different life, a different version of himself. Marcus was behind the counter, and when James walked in, Marcus simply nodded. No questions, no comments about the media speculation, no apology for whatever the town had done in his absence. "I need some weather stripping," James said. "I'll see," Marcus said, "third shelf." And that was all. The moment of reclamation was that simple. A man buying hardware and the store owner pointing him toward what he needed, both of them silent, both of them understanding that words had been sufficient to destroy peace, but silence could rebuild it. The Corinne Phillips story became local history rather than current event. New conflicts emerged. A dispute between the town council and a developer about turning an abandoned parking lot into luxury condos. Arguments about whether the community center was being run equitably. Questions about whether the local school board had made the right choice about remote learning policies. The community that had united against Corinne's cruelty fragmented again along familiar lines of class and belief and history. That fracturing was, in its own way, a kind of healing. The momentary fantasy of consensus gave way to the messier reality of how actual communities worked. James Hutchins receded from public view, which meant that the narrative around him was complete. The story was that a good man had been falsely accused, a community had defended him, and justice had been served. That Corinne was gone, that she was broken, that the ending was satisfying. No one acknowledged the parts of the story that didn't fit neatly into that arc. No one talked about the fact that James's PTSD had worsened, that he was still having panic attacks, that he'd increased his medication and was still not sleeping well. No one talked about the fact that making him a symbol hadn't actually helped him heal. It had just added a new layer of weight to carry. No one talked about whether the community's celebration of itself had actually been, in some subtle way, another form of performance, another way of congratulating themselves for being good people. And no one talked about Corinne Phillips anymore at all. She'd taken a job at a nonprofit in Asheville, the same city where James had gone to recover. It was a smaller role than she'd had before, a position focused on data analysis rather than public-facing advocacy. She'd found a therapist, a good one this time, not the kind who'd enabled her but the kind who would call her on her bullshit. She lived in a small apartment without posting about it on Instagram. She had no social media presence to speak of. She went to work and came home and sat with her own thoughts and the slowly accumulating evidence of how much damage her certainty had done. Sometimes, sitting at a stoplight in Asheville, she would wonder if James Hutchins was still there, if they were existing in the same physical location, without knowledge of each other, parallel tracks of recovery that had both started in Riverside and had both led away from it. She never contacted him, never sent a follow-up apology, never tried to make it right in any way that might ease her conscience. That was something Dr. Fiona Chen, her new therapist, had been clear about. "Reaching out to him again would be for you," Dr. Chen had said. "It would be you trying to assuage your guilt, and he's already given enough. Let him have the gift of your silence." So Corinne stayed silent, and in that silence was something like wisdom, the understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you've wronged is to stop trying to do anything at all. By February, the Riverside Gazette published an editorial about community resilience, citing the Corinne Phillips incident as an example of a town standing up for one of its own. The editorial was positive, affirming, congratulatory. It quoted several people who talked about how the community had come together. It didn't quote James Hutchins, because he'd made clear he wouldn't participate. It didn't mention that the community had also nearly broken him in the process of defending him. It didn't acknowledge the complexity and cost and unintended consequences of collective action, even when that action was morally justified in its impulse. What the editorial did do was close a chapter. It said, "This happened, we were good, the end." That's the version of the story Riverside told itself, and eventually, that was the only version anyone remembered. Because that's what communities do. They select the narrative that makes them feel best about themselves, and they hold onto that narrative with the fierceness of prayer. The parts that don't fit, they discard. The pain that remains, they minimize. The ongoing consequences, they pretend don't matter compared to the satisfaction of having been right. James Hutchins was left with the wreckage of all that. The public vindication that didn't feel like vindication. The community support that felt like surveillance. The knowledge that he'd been wronged, but also that the righting of that wrong had somehow made everything worse. He continued to buy his hardware on Tuesdays. He continued to see his therapist twice a week. He continued to take medication and do breathing exercises and live a life that was fundamentally altered by one moment of someone else's cruelty and the community's complicated response to it. He didn't move away. He didn't disappear. He did what he'd always done. He survived, he adapted, he found a way to live with the hand he'd been dealt. And sometimes, standing in the hardware store with the same package of brackets he'd bought that first Tuesday, he would think about Corinne Phillips, wherever she was, and he would think about how they were both carrying the weight of what had happened between them, and how that weight might be the only real connection that would ever exist between them. He didn't forgive her exactly, but he stopped needing her to suffer as evidence that he'd been right, because he already knew he'd been right, and knowing that wasn't enough, but it was something. 2 years later, Corinne Phillips sat in a coffee shop in Asheville and listened to her therapist describe something called moral injury. It's what happens when you cause harm to someone, Dr. Chen was explaining, and you can't undo it. The knowledge that your actions caused real damage and that damage is permanent, and you have to carry that knowing for the rest of your life. Is that what I have? Corinne asked. I think so, Dr. Chen said gently. And I also think that's not the worst thing. The worst thing would be if you didn't know it. If you'd moved on and convinced yourself you'd been right all along. The fact that you know you caused harm and that you're sitting with that knowledge is actually the beginning of something like redemption. Corinne didn't feel redeemed. She felt like a person who'd spent 2 years trying to build something out of the wreckage of what she'd destroyed and who was only beginning to understand that the wreckage wasn't hers to rebuild. It was James's. It was Marcus's. It was the whole community's. She'd changed jobs again, not out of necessity this time, but because the nonprofit had been too similar to what she'd been doing before, too much identification with causes and communities, and the assumption that she had something valuable to offer. Now she worked for a company that did technical writing, updating user manuals, and creating documentation for software no one would remember in 5 years. It was boring and impersonal and perfect. It meant she went to work and did her job and came home and didn't define her entire existence through moral crusades or community activism. She'd stopped reading Nextdoor. She'd deleted Instagram. She'd abandoned the fiction that she was some kind of justice warrior and had simply become a person, a regular person, someone who'd done something terrible and was trying to do less terrible things going forward. And 500 miles away, James Hutchins was doing something similar. The quiet work of learning how to exist without being a symbol, without the weight of vindication, without the story. Neither of them knew about the other's recovery. Neither of them would ever know. And perhaps that was the truest ending the story could have. Not reconciliation, not understanding, but simply the separate, distant work of two people learning to live with the consequences of one moment. The headline in the Riverside Gazette had read, "Corinne messed with a veteran, whole community stood up." The story that followed was about community resilience and the power of standing together. But the real story, the story that never made it into print, was more complicated. It was about a woman whose certainty had caused harm. It was about a man whose trauma had been compounded by the response to that harm. It was about a community that had done the right thing in the wrong way, that had celebrated itself rather than healed the damage. It was about the fact that sometimes justice and rightness and being on the right side of history isn't enough. Sometimes you need something else: wisdom, humility, the understanding that human conflict is complicated and consequences are permanent. Sometimes you need to just let people be broken and broken and broken and try to be less broken tomorrow. But that story doesn't fit into headlines. It doesn't give anyone the satisfaction of a clean ending. So it stays invisible, the way most true stories do, visible only to the people living them. And in coffee shops in Asheville and hardware stores in Riverside, two people who would never know each other were learning that particular lesson. that the world is large enough for both of them to exist, and broken enough that both of them would carry their breaking forward into whatever came next.